Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to episode 2 of The Scheme of Things. This is Zaki.
This is Tala Ibrahim.
So, Talha, how has your fortnight been?
Yes, I started this Netflix series, Ratchet.
I just finished it myself.
Okay, nice.
Speaking of Netflix, by the way, unfortunately, all of my good seasons are coming to an end.
Okay.
I am a big fan of British comedy, and uh,
Oh,
my favorite series, including my wife's, we used to watch Toast of London, featuring Matt Berry.
excellent series, excellent series. I really enjoyed
You
it.
can never get enough of Matt Berry,
Yes,
to be
yes,
honest.
yes.
And so all my seasons are coming to an end, and so I was recently motivated by somebody to install this new app. I won't mention the name; it will sound like a paid promotion, but I am not. It's a local streaming app. Didn't find it useful. I'll tell you about it later. As far as the topics are concerned, yeah, there are quite a lot of topics, but I'm going to particularly focus. What I have planned actually is the first thing which caught my eye over the past fortnight was this paper released sometime around mid September by Dhruva Jayashankar, and I think some of the viewers may know that Mr. Dhruva Jayashankar is the son of Dr. Subramaniam Jayashankar, who is the Indian Foreign Minister, the External Affairs Minister, and who was just formerly the Foreign Secretary. And obviously, we know that the Jayashankars, their father, K. Subramaniam, he's known as the doyen of strategic thought in India. He was actually the one who played a key role in developing the nuclear doctrine of India, which still remains quite ambiguous and multifold. And that paper was basically about Indo-Australian security cooperation, and it particularly focused on military cooperation apart from the strategic angle. It was published exclusively for the Australia-based Lowy Institute. Some people, especially the Chinese commentators, they say that Lowy Institute is a propaganda arm of the Australian government. But anyways, it's their opinion. It is titled "The Australia-India Strategic Partnership: Accelerating Security Cooperation in the Indo-Pacific." So there are some points over here which I extracted, but I've also summarized them, and I wanted to discuss. And you are most welcome, Tala, to add your to pause me in between and add your take on it, because I'll add some of my comments over there as well. So interestingly, while Dhruva Jayashankar has been a long-time advocate of Act East Asia policy in the Indo-Pacific, in this particular paper, he has actually tried to point out the discrepancies and the divergences between the Indian and Australian approaches to the Indo Pacific concept. Very interesting, because you don't find this from someone who has himself remained an advocate, and um, it would not be prudent to say that what Dhruva Jayashankar is saying reflects the Indian government's position, but we have to keep in mind that his working papers have been carried forward by the MEA in India, so it might reflect some sort of an official endorsement as well to a particular extent. So, for starters, Dhruva writes that for India, the entire Indian Ocean will take precedence, while for Australia, it will be the Southwest Indian Ocean in its immediate north and the South Pacific. So, the first thing he points out in that very large paper is that India will obviously concern itself with the entire Indian Ocean, the IOR. But for Australia, according to him, it will only be concerned with the Southwest Indian Ocean. And I think you can see a lot of that going on, that Australia isn't too eager to venture into Western Indian Ocean. I, for one, have not come across any sort of posturing which would indicate that they've taken an interest in the Western Indian Ocean. So, I mean, Japan obviously has, the US definitely, and India as well. And then he summarizes it as follows, that there are three factors which constrain bilateral strategic cooperation between India and Australia. Number one, he says, mismatched capabilities. Very interesting point. Number two, he mentions asymmetric priorities. And number three, he mentions contrasting strategic circumstances. So, coming to point one, mismatched capabilities. I'll just quickly skim over it. I don't want to go into detail. He says that India is invested more into carrier battle groups and nuclear powered ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs, which Australia doesn't seek. So, this is educational for me as someone who's been watching the place, and I'm sure this might interest you as well. Australia, while it doesn't have an interest in SSBNs, it doesn't have an interest in carrier battle groups, which of course our favorite Mr. Rawat was very eager to blow down. So you don't see that happening as well. And then he says that the Indian Air Force has limited power projection capabilities and it is dependent on Russian platforms, true, Sukhoi and MiG, etc. And he points out that basically the most unifying factor among Indo-Australian forces is the special forces cooperation, and large-scale exercises have been difficult. So this is quite an acknowledgement. And he says that he points out that although both countries, India and Australia, have P-8 aircraft for maritime patrols and reconnaissance, but the cooperation is difficult because they don't have a secure communication channel. I think you've been following the news that India and the US are about to sign a BICA, Basic Exchange Cooperation Agreement, right? So they already signed Comcasa. You know why Comcasa is important? Because that enables secure communication between same platforms being used by different armies. So they don't have it with Australia. So obviously, when they're partaking in joint exercises or multinationals such as Malabar, you won't see that sort of interaction taking place because of these hindrances. I think this is a very pertinent point that he mentioned, that India is dependent more on platforms which are of Russian origin and which do not necessarily conform with Australia's platforms which are more of US origin and European origin. And then coming to the next point, he mentions about asymmetric priorities. He says that for Australia, I quote, the challenge of China relates to its own politics, society, and economy, whereas for India, China is a direct military threat. Very interesting point. Again, you see, it is true that Australia wants to increase its economic cooperation with China. The only reason it has been apprehensive is about, because of the US State Department trying to push about Huawei allegedly trying to, create backdoors, and the Chinese allegedly involved in industrial espionage, etc., or trying to create so-called sleeper cells on Australian territory. And indeed, Australia does not perceive China as the sort of strategic threat which India does. And obviously, I recently completed this very interesting course by Stimson. They have that strategic chain. It's a link between China, India, and Pakistan. Australia's strategic dynamics are not impacted by whatever China does on the nuclear front. That is also a big point. And then he says that for India, defense engagements have taken precedence over economic and trade ties in the Indo-Pacific, particularly after 2012. Thus, Indian engagement with Myanmar or Vietnam has often been defense-led. By contrast, Australia has often placed a higher priority on economic and trade engagement with its strategic partners. Again, I don't need to elaborate this point further. It's crystal clear that he's mentioned a very pertinent point. And coming to the second last point, he mentions about the differing strategic circumstances. So now this is where it gets more interesting. Dhruva Jaishankar writes that Australia is significantly more dependent on the US for its security and on China for its prosperity than India, whereas India is much less integrated with the US security structures and supply chains linked to China. Then he says, in Australia, frustrations persist relating to India's inability or unwillingness to seamlessly integrate with US alliance led operational protocols and procedures. I think he is referring to India taking a lot of time, many years, to first sign the LMOA and then sign the Comcasa, and now they've taken a lot of time to sign the and it's still unclear whether they will sign the BICA or not. I think they eventually will. But
Definitely,
you
definitely.
see,
Yes.
you see where this is going. So India is trying to chart its own course. It's focused on China and that whole two and a half prong war, whatever it is, yeah, two front war. While Australia, it is totally dependent on that US led Pacific architecture. Good points. Now, coming to the last portion of his paper, which will conclude my segment right now, is the way forward according to Dhruva Jaishankar. You see, we may have differing opinions, but as a research fellow, I admire his efforts to try to postulate a way forward. And in his understanding, I am actually a long time reader and I admire his writings from an academic angle. This is according to what Dhruva Jaishankar are the gray areas that need to be covered so that Indo-Australian cooperation can be further boosted and the impediments can be removed. So first he says that bilateral contacts should be institutionalized with additional 2+2 ministerial dialogues, obviously defense and foreign ministries. Then he says that further coordination in forums such as East Asia Summit, but especially groupings in which India and Australia play leadership roles, such as the Indian Ocean Rim Association, are necessary to advance a common agenda between like minded partners. So, obviously, how much of interest Australia will take in IORA. We've discussed IORA a lot, so I won't go into the detail. Then he says that current maritime exercises should be less scripted and cater to contingencies. Interesting choice of words. Less scripted. Yes, that is the general impression. You are suddenly involving so many players, all the quad players into the Malabar. You are engaged in cooperation with Australia and posturing, naval posturing in the Strait of Malacca near the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. You've set your eyes on, you had this very talented Indian researcher who suggested that India should give Australia access to Andaman and Nicobars in exchange for India getting access to Cocos Islands, where Australia has a foothold. So obviously, that whole thing going on. And need I mention, just recently, Australia and India concluded their bilateral maritime exercise in the Eastern Indian Ocean. Okay, so that thing is also going on, and he says that they should be less scripted. I think that points toward the fact that yes, indeed, all of these exercises seem to be more of a hype or the hyperbole, trying to give a message to China and trying to show everyone that all of the Quad stakeholders are in place. We saw that recent Quad meeting of the foreign ministers. They were all trying to, say that we all are one, the Quad does exist. And for the first time, you saw the actual term Quad being mentioned in press releases. So that's also something. Then he says closer Air Force and Army cooperation might extend to more regular exercises, refueling and training in jungle and desert warfare. And this is important because, as he mentioned earlier as well, Indo Australian cooperation has been mostly related to maritime or special forces. So he is suggesting that, jungle and desert warfare, it comes under special operations but also counterinsurgency. So in that regard, India has a lot more to offer to Australia than the other way around, and that is where the quid pro quo will come into place. And Australia can maybe, as an incentive, offer superior air, land, the coastal defense training to India, which it lacks as compared to Australia. And then he says that more active Australian participation in Indian defense industry expositions such as DEF Expo and Aero India can improve potential collaboration. This is the industrial angle, so I won't comment on it further. And lastly, he says, deepening and broadening trade and economic linkages would add further elements of trust, stability, and interest in the bilateral relationships. I'm just going to wrap it up here by mentioning what Kashun emphasized in our other show previously. She talked about Pakistan must look to the east, despite many people suggesting that it would be an imprudent move, and despite the Look Africa policy. So here we have Dhruva Jaishankar, who has a visibility. He has visited Australia several times. He's visited the Andamans also, and he has good knowledge of the region. He himself is suggesting that India should not just look at Eastern Indian Ocean and the Pacific through the prism of defense. It should build on trade and economics. So I think, in a way, he is also validating and reiterating what Kashun suggested in the program, and the overall fact that if you have to make your way in the region, economics and trade will always dominate, because whatever the rhetoric being espoused by US State Department, Indian MEA, and Australian Foreign Affairs Ministry, they're saying that we want to, even the Japanese, that we give ASEAN the central role in the Indo-Pacific. So that central role will not be defense-led. They are not interested in taking sides. They want people who are investing in their countries.
Precisely. Now is my time. Okay. So a lot of interesting points you have made, and yes, you have.
Dhruva has made.
Dhruva has made, and you have got this East Asia has come up in the conversation. So, quite interestingly, you mentioned that ASEAN is not interested in being ASEAN is not interested in getting militarily geared up against China. So this aspect has been highlighted in the conversations that have been made by US officials. If I can recall it correctly, we saw this in an interview that was given by Pompeo some days back, in which he said that in which he talked about some effective multilateralism in the region, in the East Asian region. So that
Yes.
means that for the United States, ASEAN is a lost cause, and they are his comment. It is not that Pompeo has talked about effective multilateralism in the region. Last year, a deputy in the State Department, Stephen Biegun, has talked about
Yes.
strong multilateral structures. There is an absence of strong multilateral structures, and there is certainly at some point of time we need to formalize a structure like this. Some comments of this sort. So this means that this in the institutionalization context that is once again mentioned in this paper that you have talked about in the conclusions.
Yes.
Even the US officials do not consider this as an effective institutionalized arrangement, this current dispensation between India, Japan, Australia, and the United States.
Yeah, the Quad.
In the Quad. And they are now emphasizing on results-oriented multilateralism. So they are now more into this mode that the ASEAN nations need not just speak up but also act up against China. And on its part, ASEAN refuses to pick side in this intensified US-China strategic rivalry in which India is also now a major stakeholder. So, okay, so quite interestingly, we saw that some days back, on 6th of October to be precise, the foreign ministers of Quad countries met in Japan. And I was expecting some concrete conclusions at the end of the meeting. What's your reading about the situation? What happened at the Quad meeting? What's your reading about this? Because I think that if something was discussed, if something significant was discussed, it wasn't brought to the fore. So it is perhaps lending more credence to the argument that even this meeting uh, didn't result in something concrete. So, what's your reading?
I personally think I'd have to agree with you, and I'd just like to frame it in the sense that I personally think it was indeed more ceremonial than it was cause driven, because of the fact that you see, the whole concept of Quad, it started on more than 10 years ago with Shinzo Abe. So I personally think, I may be wrong, this is my personal inference, that Abe knew well in advance, because you see, these sort of meetings of foreign ministers and heads of state, they're not held on an ad hoc basis. You need to make plannings in advance, almost a year or a half a year in advance. You have to take the consent and coordinate with all the ministries in the guest countries and find out their availabilities and their schedules. So obviously, I think that since Abe was planning since long to groom the new Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga, I think the message he wanted to give was that he had in advance planned that once I would be out of the picture and Suga would be in, then there would be a lot of, unrest within Quad allies about what is going to be the status of the arrangement between these four countries, the Nexus, the Quad. And I think that this, and the fact that it was held in Tokyo, I think it was more of a reaffirmation that Quad is still here, and it was just a reiteration of a resolve and nothing else. And also, I would just like to add this very interesting Brookings paper published by, it's not a paper actually, it's a content published by Miss Tanvi Madan, and she published these very interesting infographics and statistics about, she
Yes.
identified these patterns, most used words from various statements over the years. So I wouldn't go into the detail. You can Google it up. I'm speaking to the audience here. You can Google it up. You'll come across those infographics, and then you'll realize that the pattern shows this one was nothing extraordinary. I couldn't also find anything which is extraordinary.
Actually, the idea of Quad goes back much further, much farther back to the early 1970s. So the original idea was floated by Australia, and
No.
even then, Canberra wanted to respond to a supposed Asian conquest plot by China. But even then, like now, we saw this. We saw this despondency by certain Quad countries, United States, and even the reading of Dhruva Jaishankar have somehow similar conclusions that there is a lukewarm response from the East Asian countries regarding how to proceed with the politics of Quad. Even at that time, there was a very lukewarm response. We know that in even in 1954, we get this example, and when Seattle was created to stop the early communist threat to Asia, it had only managed to attract Philippines and Thailand as Asian members. So we are seeing a
Yes.
repeat, a somewhat repeat of that mentality again in the regional politics around Indian Ocean region.
Indeed, and again, you see India, you see the United States, you see Japan, and for some reason or the other, which is beyond my intellectual capacity, at least, speaking very humbly, I have not been. I have always felt this sort of a distinct relation that India, Japan, and the US have this very effective trilateral working relationship, while Australia is always, just, it's just on the side. It's like a foster child or something. You don't see it factor in into the whole equation the way those other three countries do, especially not only in the military domain, but also when it comes to, for example, trade and commerce, or we are talking about people to people relations. And when we talk about people to people relations, then India and Australia, don't we all know that since the Manmohan Singh era, there have been a lot of issues that in which Indians were subjected to racism and attacks in Australia, and there was a very disconcerting period going on when even people with other people with brown skin like you and me, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis also, they were accused and they were specifically called Indians, and they were attacked because there was a sense of xenophobia prevailing in Australia for reasons unknown. I haven't gone into the um, sociological aspect of it. That's beyond me. But you see, again, that adds into what you were asking me, and that further reiterates your own point that this whole quad thing and this, trying to form an alliance and give a unified message to China, I think it doesn't work. It doesn't work.
You're very right. In
So,
fact, I've often thought about uh, getting a survey conducted, taking responses from people in different Asian countries, uh, especially the Southeast Asian side, even to some extent uh, the South Asian region and Southeast Asian region. How do they perceive uh, in India's actions with regards to uh, in inviting inviting a country beyond Pacific, beyond Atlantic, yeah, to come and to come and be a contestant in the geopolitics of the region? How do common people perceive this? Perceive this? I'm very inquisitive, and I think it
uh,
should be
uh,
done.
that is indeed a very good point. And, we all know that India's strategic community and its research establishment is far too powerful and more influential as compared to Pakistan's. And, remarkably, these people, um, even people such as late Brigadier retired Gurmeet Kamal, who was um, one of the people who drafted the proactive operations doctrine, the cold start doctrine, and he was one of the first few cronies of the strategic establishment who advocated for coming out of that so-called strategic autonomy paradigm and telling India that you will have to partner with the US for a long-term sustained relationship. And most of his and other thinkers' working papers were actually implemented in letter and spirit by the Obama administration. And so that turnaround, I think India has been very successful in trying to mold its national fabric, its communities, and its people into accepting that so-called change of heart. And that goes to show a lot of things. And I think indeed, as far as the survey aspect is concerned, yes, definitely, I think that would make for a very good survey. Interestingly.
Okay, so we had discussed this prior to this podcast that we shall be discussing uh, the development related to the Dornier aircraft that was given
The
to
Maldives.
Maldives by India. So, what are your
Yes,
views on?
yes. So we are going to shift west from the Eastern Indian Ocean. We are coming now. We are moving now to the Western Indian Ocean, and particularly this Maldives is located in what people call the Southern Indian Ocean, and this is the Indian Strategic Community speaking. So, in fact, I remember very distinctly, Talha, when you were making notes that you have something to share on Maldives as well. So, in the context of sharing news about Maldives, I have actually two developments. One is I'm going to be very brief about it. Maldives in India have formally recently launched their cargo service, which will not only enable people to people travel, but also it will encourage trade and business ties. I'm going to highlight this particular point in detail, that this whole project. So we're talking about. I'm going to share two aspects of Indo-Maldivian relations. The cargo service. When Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited Maldives in June 2019, he announced the launch of this ferry service. So it has taken just a little more than a year, and it will connect two ports in India with two sister ports in Maldives. Those two ports are Thoothukudi, and which is also known as Tuticorin. It is in the eastern seaboard, so it faces the eastern Indian Ocean, and Cochin, which is in the western seaboard. So these two Indian ports will be linked with two ports in Maldives, namely Kulhudu Fushi and Male. I hope I'm pronouncing the former name correctly, and no offense to any Maldivian listening to this. So Kulhudu Fushi and Male ports, and both of these are around the Tamil Nadu area in the southern tip of the Indian mainland. So one port in the western seaboard, one port in the eastern seaboard, both are going to move southwest to Maldives and connect these two ports. And the objective is that this ferry service will run twice a month, and the benefits for India is that not only has it recently helped the Maldives overcome various natural disasters and provide COVID supplies, Maldives, as a matter of fact, is 100% dependent on foreign imports to keep its country running. So I think if India makes sufficient ingress for its businessmen and trader community to increase the dependability on India as compared to any other country, then that will give it a unique advantage through which it can further incentivize strategic cooperation. And what the Maldivian government has done, because the current government is pro India, the previous one was pro China, they have approved a 50% reduction in custom duties for Indian products which arrive at Kuludufushi port. So they have made mutual arrangements to support each other, incentivize especially the fisher community, the fishermen, the people involved in the marine economy, to promote collaboration with each other, but also people to people ties. I mean, for example, people want to take a trip, go on a tourism visit, or they want to, just engage in some petty business over there. So they'll just catch a ferry and they'll go into Maldives and vice versa. So I think, as far as soft power is concerned, this holds immense symbolic value, and the fact that it has materialized just within a year or something, which is quite unusual, because the Indian bureaucracy, Talha, I think you know also very well how lethargic they are. Defense plans and other trade and economic plans, they keep on lying for a decade and a half, until something is approved and finalized. But here you have this thing being so extraordinarily sped up, that it does goes to show you how committed and focused India is on Maldives. Speaking of focus, the next and final point on this topic from my side is that India provided a Dornier maritime surveillance aircraft to the Maldives National Defense Force. The objective, reportedly according to what the media has said, is to keep a closer eye on, I quote, the movement of Chinese vessels in regional waters, unquote. The reports go on to add that the Dornier aircraft will operate under the command and control of Maldives, while the running costs, the operational costs, will be borne by India. So basically, it's just, and there is a saying in Pakistani, there is a saying, "Aap kaan idhar se pakad lo ya udhar se pakad lo." If you can, it doesn't matter whether you hold your ear from the left side or the right side, you're holding the ear. So even if Maldives is going to spearhead, you're giving them the control, but the fact that India is going to be financing it, uh, you know, the buck stops where the person who is paying the buck. So if India will decide how and when the maneuvering of that aircraft will be, what sort of flight missions it will carry, the reconnaissance missions it is going to conduct, what sort of flight path it is supposed to chart, all of that I think ultimately is going to be decided by the Indian Navy. And this is not just for, to be fair, it's not just for strategic operations, but also to complement medical evacuation operations. So obviously there's that humanitarian assistance and disaster relief aspect as well. But interestingly, the final point over here is, you might say that India is trying to push Maldives into getting this Dornier. In fact, it's the opposite. uh, Maldivian President Abdullah Yameen, when he visited India in 2016, it was actually he who requested India for this aircraft. Was China not adamant on giving one? Did Maldives approach any other government? I don't know. I haven't come across any other such literature. But the fact that the Maldives was hoping and ultimately it got what it wanted, and media reports say the objective is to keep watch on China. So breaking news for Pakistan, or rather, not breaking news. Maldives is near Lakshadweep and Minicoy Islands, and you have East Africa to the left. You have the Gwadar and all to the north. So obviously, we are not talking about Andaman and Nicobar, or the traditional posturing in the SCS or this and that. You won't expect Maldivian aircraft to fly thousands of miles to the Eastern Indian Ocean to keep an eye on China. Obviously, they're talking about the Western Indian Ocean, and the Indian Navy having its bases, FOBs, in the Lakshadweep. You're going to see maybe in the mid to long term future, you'll see Maldivian aircraft carrying out landing and takeoff exercises from Lakshadweep. That is something which I think is going to happen in the mid to long term future. But this is just a speculation, and we'll wait and see how much of that. But finally, I think if nothing else, at least these aircraft will be able to provide more accurate naval intelligence to Indian Navy when China, the PLA Navy, once or twice, once in a year or once in 2 years, when it comes into the Western Indian Ocean and it irks New Delhi. So it will be able to track the Chinese submarines more effectively.
Okay, so quite interestingly, my observation about what's happening in Maldives vis-a-vis India is quite different. So we are talking about just recent past. There was a Twitter hashtag that trended on the Maldivian. The Twitter hashtag that trended on Maldives, India out.
Oh,
was in
interesting.
India out. So there is a dissent fomenting among the public, and the Maldivians are protesting quite vociferously against India's military presence in their island nation.
Interesting.
There
Interesting.
was this hashtag that came out. There was a motorbike rally that happened, and according to the news reports, it was the second such event in recent weeks to protest against India's military presence on Maldivian soil. So now you talked about ferry service. You talked about the Dornier aircraft that has been provided to the Maldivian Air Force, but people are very much perceiving it in a very negative manner. The way India has the current incumbent government of I guess the present name is Ibrahim Mohammed Solih. Okay, the present name is Ibrahim Mohammed Solih. So the Solih government has formalized a new agreement in which it will allow the Indian courts to adjudicate
Mm-hmm.
on issues in Maldives that impact on Indian economic interest. So
Wow,
even
wow. I
so,
didn't know that.
so even this is not being perceived in a friendly manner by the Maldivian people, and India is apparently insisting on. India has apparently insisted on this agreement because earlier, back in 2012. A minister in the earlier Maldivian government, Hussein Sharif, has given a quote to a certain newspaper that the Maldivian government uh, uh, annulled an agreement related to Indian invested airport. So we need to watch Maldives more closely. Uh, uh, even the journalist community has recently inquired from the speaker of the Maldivian parliament, Mohammad Nasheed. He's considered as pro-India.
Oh, definitely. He's very pro-India.
He's very
In fact,
pro-India.
his first regime was installed by New Delhi.
Yes. So, in his interview to the press, he's talked about how the India Out hashtag, the social media tagline of India Out, was being used predominantly by foreigners. And
Typical,
okay.
typical, typical.
and and a very and I found it very comical. He said that it is a characteristics of developed nations to have military personnel of other nations.
Wow, wow. So,
Okay.
what is Mr. Nasheed suggesting? Does he want the US or India to? Does he want India to replicate the US model of, entrenching itself in Sri Lanka, the way Sri Lanka was quickly, persuaded into signing the AXA, and US has practically taken over its facilities without any question or some sort of a legal obligations and liabilities. So what is he expecting? That's what I was just going to comment this out of a joke, but now that you've mentioned it, it gets even more funnier, and now it's become more ironic because if they're talking about foreign actors, isn't India a foreign actor?
Of course, it is.
Yes, but then you see, and don't we know, Talha, that there is the particular tiny island of the Maldivian main archipelago which has been acquired by China and it has been bothering the Indians for a while now.
Yes, China has invested heavily in Maldives, and sort of like this this contestation, this competition is going on.
But do you
Uh,
think, Talha, what you've mentioned, these are the things which I didn't read, and it's very interesting to hear this from you. Do you think that if India, for example, as far as the marine economy is concerned, they're able to uh, increase Maldives' dependence on India and become like the primary uh, import market for Maldives, do you think that will remove the general perception of the public, or are their grievances? Are they more informed about what the long-term implications are?
uh, I think I'm not well read enough to comment on that. I'll have to think about it. But from the Maldivian side, in the general public, there is this impression that India tries to superimpose itself, uh, uh, superimpose itself in the Maldivian politics and even security affairs. Uh, Very interesting point. I read this that in 2013, India provided apparently two helicopters to the India gave these two helicopters to the Maldivian government, like they have given this Dhoni aircraft.
Yeah.
And what happened was this Asia Times has quoted a Maldivian aviation expert, and on the condition of anonymity, of course, they haven't named him or her. Whoever. So they have said that the Indian choppers that are stationed in Maldives were presented by New Delhi as a gift in 2013, and that gesture was welcomed at that time in Malé, the capital city of Maldives. So at that time, Maldives was expanding its military aviation capabilities, but it lacked. But it lacked the capabilities. Indian pilots at that time agreed to operate the equipment until the Maldivian personnel could be trained. And
Exactly.
and since that time, the Indian it became sort of like an excuse to station their personnel on the Maldivian soil. Another more interesting point in the same report was that the Indian Nasheed government is also criticized for this, and there is a general perception that the procurement that have been done in the past from the Indian governments have proven to be problematic. They say that the Nasheed government failed to scrutinize Indian helicopter suitability in Maldivian conditions after having agreed to receive the aircraft in 2010. These helicopters were unable to fly at night or even in inclement weather. These helicopters were not suitable for flying. So this
Substandard equipment.
it was, maybe it's not substandard equipment, but there was this failure to disclose what is to come next, the strings that were attached with these with this gift. So this is a general perception in Maldives regarding Indian government, and we need to focus. We should focus more on the politics that is happening between both the countries. In perhaps in mid to long term, I think this resentment will grow.
That's an interesting observation, and I think from what I've made out from your observations is that it might be possible that India wanted intentionally to keep the Maldivian National Defense Force dependent on its personnel for training, and that is why maybe they may not have intentionally imparted that sort of a training so that they could become self-dependent or autonomous. So I think that goes also into the technicalities of the military aviation assets which you mentioned. And again, you see that goes on. It's been more than a decade now. You talked about 2010. I'm talking about 2020. After 10 years, if you still need India to finance the functioning of those aircraft, you're still letting them pull the strings, which goes to show that you may consider India having a waning influence in this particular island country, but New Delhi has been able to keep a hold on the defense aspect. And now it seems that if we talk from the non defense, that is the economic aspect, now maybe their intention is because the fact which I mentioned about Maldives, its economic dependency on foreign imports, etc., etc. I didn't have to check out Wikipedia or any straight statistics. The Indian media reports, which gave coverage to the ferry service, they mentioned these facts, and I think they were actually talking to the broader Indian public, telling them and in maybe informing the business community that Maldives is totally dependent. You have your opportunity here to make them reliant exclusively on Indian origin goods and services. So from both the angles, I think that's their ultimate objective, that the string should remain with New Delhi.
And see, I think that this resentment is New Delhi is recognizing that there is some problem with the way we are dealing with with Maldives. So because this adjudication, this law that has come up, that all the business activities that have some that are related to the Indians, or all the investments that will be done by the Indian government, they will be educated according to the Indian law. So this is a very interesting development. So
But
you are
Talha,
right.
what is the difference? What is the difference between Indians entering into Maldives and being governed by Indian law, okay, and just nearby the Americans entering Sri Lanka and being governed by American law? Both these island countries have ceded that legal sovereignty, that the principle of sovereignty basically is, I think, foundationed upon the fact that the host country is able to prosecute or charge people within its territory according to its own laws. Both of them have actually, I mean, that part about adjudicating the rights to Indian courts, that is news for me, and that's quite alarming.
Yes, it is. Okay, so since we talked about Andaman, I'm sure you must have read this piece that I shared on my Twitter handle, written by Fateh Mulk. Fateh Mulk
A very good
Saab,
piece.
yes,
Thank you for
it's
sharing.
it's a very
Thank you
good
for
piece.
sharing.
Okay, so Fateh Mulk Saab, apparently, I have to search on the internet. But Fateh Mulk Saab belongs to the Chitradi royal family, and he writes on history issues. So I found that piece very interesting, and I would like you to comment briefly about it, because I think that we need to end soon. So some comments from you about the piece for the convention of audience.
Yes, I think the part about the Pakistani leadership of the time, the founding leaders who attempted to try to gain control of Andaman Islands. I think that just goes to show you, you know, before you tweeted that article, believe you me, I am the guy who sits online and I love to read the history about this Indian Ocean region. And for some reason, and I'm particularly thankful to the writer, I could not believe the headline I was reading, and then I had to actually open and read it. That yes, Pakistan was interested. We all know that Andaman and Nicobar were initially, you know, they're being sought after by the Japanese. Okay, and India successfully did manage to get them, and the fact that just goes to show you how visionary Pakistan's leadership of the time were. I mean, just imagine the the impeccable nature of that vision, that you started off from mainland India, West Bengal, Delhi, and Mumbai, and then you go to Karachi and all. But you're thinking about the long term future of Andaman and what its strategic utility could be for Pakistan. I mean, just imagine that sort of leadership over there, that visionary leadership who were looking more than 50 years ahead about what sort of value it would add to Pakistan's territory. And this just goes to show you that while Pakistan was obviously not able to realize that and try to bring Andaman under its fold, because that would, I think it would have been a logistical and administrative nightmare in the present scenario, with India positioned in between trying to control the Andamans. I mean, if Bangladesh was still East Pakistan, that would have been another story. But yet again, um, but but on the western side, Pakistan was able to secure Gwadar and the Makran coastal belt from Oman. ठीक है? So this article, if you view it in the proper context, it actually goes to show you that our national leadership of the time, the founding leadership, the founding fathers, the founding Madri Millat, they were all thinking from the mindset of that era in which maritime power played also a very important role, which you don't see nowadays. We have all the talk about a blue economy and this and that, but successive leadership since then has not looked into how Andaman could have been an opportunity, or even you don't talk about Andaman, talk about Lakshadweep. What is the harm in Lakshadweep? I mean, that is also where India had tried to seize the territories and bring it into its fold from the former undivided India. So, I personally would recommend that the people watching us and listening to this podcast, Talha was shared this fantastic piece by Fateh Mulk Saab. You should look into it. And now people like me, nobodies, who are looking at all these strategic exercises, military infrastructure being built in Andamans, how now after more than 70 years of Pakistan's independence, how that is serving as one of the most crucial pivots in deciding great power competition between US and China in this region, and how that is something we missed and we didn't focus on adequately as we should have. And I think still we got Makran and we got Oman, the coastal belt, but I think this is a debate which needs to be elaborated in more detail in some other segment. But thanks for sharing that article. That was so refreshing to read. It added a lot of knowledge which I did not have before, and it is definitely a must read.
Okay,
Speaking
so
of which, now since we are in the Western Indian Ocean region, and I think now I need to move a bit to the north, to the northwest. We come to Iran. So my third and final segment for this podcast from my side, the topic which I have chosen is the new naval base constructed by Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC Navy of Iran. So I've collected some figures. I did a bit of geo mapping, and recently the IRGC Navy. So just to clear for the audience, I won't go into details. I don't intend to give a lecture to anybody. The IRGC is a totally separate but parallel armed forces prong in conjunction to the state army, the state air force, and the state navy of Iran. So you have two prongs. President Hassan Rouhani, he controls, he is the commander of Iranian army, Artesh, Iranian navy, Iranian air force. And then you have the other prong, which is directly subservient to the supreme leader of Iran, who is the ideological leader, Mr. Khamenei. And he is the one who controls the IRGC army and the IRGC air force and the IRGC navy. So these are two separate prongs. And obviously the political ramifications of it are different. I think I mentioned this in some other previous podcast of ours, and maybe in one of my articles, that when you talk about collaboration, for example, yes, the recent Russia China Iranian naval exercise, which took place a few months ago, hosted by Iran near Bandar Abbas port, that was with the Iranian Navy, not IRGC Navy, because keeping Russia at a side, Russia doesn't care, but China is very cautious about participating in exercises with IRGC, which could upset Middle Eastern allies. So, but now we have this new naval base. Again, the point why I mentioned this very succinctly is this is an IRGC naval base, which means that number one, the very name itself suggests it has an aggressive agenda. Number one. Number two, it is directed specifically towards US naval adventurism in the region, which they perceive. And obviously now that the Israeli Arab rapprochement has also been taking place, there's an increased threat of the Arab Israeli nexus in conjunction with US Naval Central Command being able to control the entire waterways from Red Sea to Gulf of Aden to Gulf of Oman to Persian Gulf all the way to the Arc. So this base came about. Now, the name of this base, it is at Sirik. It is located in Sirik, and this is a coastal Iranian town which is to the east of Strait of Hormuz. And it is, if you look, it is just across the UAE and Omani territory, and it lies just between the divide connecting Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman, right? So facing Saudi Arabia and UAE, you have the Persian Gulf, and facing Oman and some parts of UAE like Fujairah, you have the Persian Gulf. A very, very important and sensitive maritime route, not only for ships but especially commercial marine traffic. I did some geo mapping, and I, just for the sake of public knowledge, for the audience listening to this, if you just want to have an idea of what is the exact location, you can just Google it up and enter Sirik. You'll get the map. But as far as distance is concerned, it is 390 kilometers roughly to the west of Chabahar. So it is almost 400 kilometers west of Chabahar, much further than Pakistan's area of the Makran coastal belt. And it is just 114 kilometers east of Bandar Abbas. So it is between Bandar Abbas, which is the main port of Iran, where the Iranian Navy is mostly found exercising, and Chabahar. So IRGC again, you see, they are not utilizing Chabahar. I think they are apprehensive of maybe entangling the Indians and their strategic interests into something which they would not like to be a part of. So that's why they have maybe have set up this new base. And this base, since we all know, I don't need to mention this, IRGC commanders, not the Iranian military commanders, the IRGC commanders routinely, I think almost once per week, if you read agencies like the Tasneem News Agency, Meher News Agency, Fars News Agency, they issue threats to the UAE leadership that our rockets can land in Dubai, our rockets can land in Riyadh, our rockets can land in Dammam, our rockets can land in Abu Dhabi, and you are just at within our reach. And if Israel tries to attack us, we will immediately retaliate. This is in their new statement. It said that they will retaliate against the UAE if Israel strikes Iran. So, they formed their own strategic chain. So, just to give an audience the sense of what actually their distance is, the new naval base at Sirik is just 224 kilometers from Dubai. That is very, very easy for just a basic missile to reach. So, it's even more close now because people were saying that, I think maybe even Pakistan had this point that trying to build the narrative that Chabahar could be used as a sort of a strategic base against, Arab countries and trying to, play tit for tat against each other. Okay? But I don't think that that's going to work because this new base, it is more closer, and it is not just close to UAE, it is also close to Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. So the distance from Sirik base to Manama in Bahrain and Dammam is almost equivalent. To Manama it is 656 kilometers, to Dammam it is 694 kilometers. I used Google Earth for just a basic, you can say a scalar mapping. So just to get a rough idea. So these are just rough estimates. So you can see that Bahrain, the UAE comes within the first zone of an easy target. Then you have Oman, but obviously Oman is a separate story altogether. Then you have Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. And that new naval base is obviously, now you have Iran building up its assets. So what do you think? Are the Arabs not going to Saudi Arabia and the UAE? Don't you think they're going to respond to that in kind? And so you ask yourself, is this new? Well, It happens that if we move a few months ago, in June 2020, IRGC Navy Commander Rear Admiral Ali Raza Tangsiri, he said the base is built, I quote, on the request of military leadership, unquote, and would be used for protecting. I mean, this was his claim that this is for protecting Iranian vessels and counter piracy and blah blah. But interestingly, he says Rear Admiral Tangsiri, he says this was built on the recommendation of military leadership, not the political leadership. Why? And why not the regular Iranian Navy? So, what he is actually indicating is that this is built on the request of the supreme leader of Iran, keeping in view long term strategic interests. This has got nothing to do with President Rouhani and his political administration, which is an elected government in Iran. So, this is basically Mr. Khamenei and his regional agenda to create a forward outpost for the IRGC Navy. And in the next month, in July 2020, Mr. Rear Admiral Tangsiri revealed a few extra nuggets to try to create further suspense among international observers. He said that there are I repeat, underground speedboat and missile cities in southern Iran. And he said, he added in the same capacity, he said that IRGC Navy is going to be quote unquote nightmare for the US. So he named the US and he said that we are going to be a nightmare. We've built an underground city, we have underground bunkers, we have speedboats. And obviously, what are speedboats used for? They are used for maritime interdiction operations, special operations. You need to engage in hybrid war. Okay? So that naval element of a hybrid war, you don't use speedboats in a conventional naval operation. So before I conclude this segment, I would just like to quote the IRGC Chief of Staff, not the IRGC Navy, the whole entire IRGC Chief of Staff. You can basically equate him to maybe the Joint Chief or the DG Joint Staff from Pakistani angle. So IRGC Chief Commander Major General Hussein Salami, when he commented upon the new naval base at Sirik, he said, I quote, the country's combat operations, ship operations, reconnaissance, as well as defensive and offensive operations in the Persian Gulf will further develop, unquote. So I think there you have it. So if he himself is mentioning and offensive, it makes it clear that offensive, nightmare to the US, you're going to see further confrontation and contestations in this region. The question remains, while you can talk a lot about Pakistan's interests and this and that, what about Iran? I mean, I'm just curious, you mentioned about conducting a survey on how South Asian countries and Southeast Asian perceive an extra regional actor coming and, aiding India in the region. I would like to see a survey that these statements by IRGC leaders, whether they're the Army, Navy, or Air Force, are they not going to create complications for India's own ambitions in Chabahar? I mean, how can you exclude that portion and create a bubble while creating implications for other regional countries?
Of course, around 400 kilometers to the west of Chabahar, you are saying that this is an IRGC base. I haven't read much about it, but so I'm not at the liberty to comment on it as I consider best. So I would leave it up to you. What's your judgment on it? But I also agree that it would create certain complications because India has certain ambitions with regards to Chabahar, and having an IRGC naval base in the proximity of in a radius of 300 to 400 kilometers, it would obviously it would create some sort of distaste between India and the United States. Another supplementary information for those who are listening to this podcast is that the arms embargo on Iran that was put in effect by the United Nations Security Council back in 2007, if I am correct. Uh, just a
I'm
second.
unable to
Okay.
recall at this point.
Okay. So the arms embargo was put in effect in 2007 by the United Nations Security Council. It is expiring on the 18th of October. There is this. The Russians have shown their interest in selling S-400 systems to Iran. So, according to this ambassador, this Russian ambassador to Iran, I don't know how to pronounce his name, so I would go with the first name, Levan. Levan has talked about that we won't have any problems in selling S-400 weapons to Iran from October 19. And he has also mentioned that that Russia is not concerned with the threats from United States. And the US is interestingly talking about how it will unilaterally snap back international sanctions on Tehran that are according to them there is a clause in JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that they did back in 2015. They said there is this clause that would come in effect, but this utterance of US officials has been rejected by the other permanent members, and so it has not been considered. It has not been taken seriously by UK, France, Germany.
The Arabs recently gathered together, in earlier in Poland, if you remember, several months ago, and they held that Warsaw conference, and then they had one in Bahrain, and in which the Saudi Arabia was particularly vocal in trying to unite the Arabs in mentioning that whether the US goes ahead with it or not, but the Arabs will try to consistently lobby for another round of arms embargo on Iran. But then again, still that begs the question. You have the Arabs doing what they can, and that tit for tat is which is going to disrupt the strategic stability in the whole Persian Gulf has been ongoing for many decades, and it will continue to do so. But it evades me. It somehow it just is. I'm unable to understand or comprehend why New Delhi has been so eerily silent on these very provocative statements by IRGC, in which they're very clearly trying to they're very clearly mentioning what is the agenda in behind establishing this base or conducting the exercises. And while Chabar is not too far away, I mean, have they received some sort of guarantees from the other side of Iran? I mean, the ones who are maybe supposedly going to fight with Iran, that Chabahar will be kept out of it. It just simply evades me, and I think that silence is something that the international community and especially the United States itself has not sufficiently looked into. It has, during the Obama administration, the United States kept overlooking Iranian transactions with India, despite the sanctions imposed. And then you have Michael Pompeo, the Secretary of State, the US Secretary of State, who is very vocal against the CCP and Iranian leadership by name. Yet they don't see that maybe some sort of Indian assistance, the infrastructural support or other security support in Chabahar could end up being used by IRGC assets. How is that not a possibility? How is that not going to actually boost? Because I think, Talha, I think you also came across this very interesting and detailed article. It was a very lengthy article a few months ago in which highlighted how the IRGC empire is itself a business empire which has amassed billions and billions of dollars. I'm not talking about the Iranian currency, but billions of dollars. It's a self-sustaining industry. Basically, all their excursions overseas are for political and economic gains, and they have their own defense industrial base as well. So, how is Indian investment in Iran not going to support the IRGC and its navy, for example, during times in which, for example, another round of fresh sanctions are imposed? The economic lifeline will actually be provided by India.
No doubt, no doubt. These are serious concerns. These are, and
This is something which needs to be looked into. Thank you very much for your time, Talha, and thank you to the audience for tuning in. Until next time, goodbye from our side.
goodbye.